Hmm. So then with that bodhicitta, motivation, to the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. But in the text, we're up to the section on the 11 virtuous mental factors. And I said this before, I'll just remind everybody, of course, these are not whether we're covering the 11 virtuous mental factors or the 6 root delusions or the 20 secondary delusions, these are not exhaustive, right? Obviously, it doesn't include every virtue, and the non-virtue, the 26 don't include every non-virtue, but these are like key ones to understand. They come from the Abhidharma and so on. So these are like, yeah. But I just want to emphasize that point. It doesn't include every single virtue, obviously, here. And we started last time with the first of these 11, which is faith. And we were covering the 3 kinds of faith. Right? And I'll just I'll quickly remind us of the first 2, which we covered last time, and then we'll pick up with the third. So the first was we'll go back actually to the definition, right? So faith is a conviction. I said this clarity, confidence is another word some translators use for faith, right? A faith or confidence. And it's a conviction and a clarity and a wishing with respect to an existent, right? Something that actually exists, that is endowed, and that thing that exists is endowed with excellent qualities and power. And faith has the function of acting as a support for aspiration. Right? So faith is a different mental factor from aspiration, but serves as support for giving rise to aspiration. And then we covered first there was admiring faith, right, or clarifying faith. This translator said clarifying, right? And we covered that last time, but that's like where you're joyous and delighted when looking at the wonderful qualities of, for example, the 3 jewels, or Tara, or Avalokiteshvara, or your guru. Or one point I want to make here, just for all these kinds of faith, is so faith also, what's the word? It's not only realizing emptiness permanently brings about a cessation of the mental afflictions, right? But one point that's made here is faith. It's page 32. Page 32. I'm picking up the bottom of page 32. What was I saying? That faith temporarily, like it says it in the text here, it sort of it clarifies the mind, and it opposes the turbidity of mind. That was what one text said, and causes the mind to become clear and bright, or joyous and delighted. So one point is, I just want to make here is, if you're experiencing like difficult time, right, or mental afflictions, for example, then what this is indicating, it's just a reminder, then cultivate faith, right? That's an easy one in some ways. And to ask yourself, I guess, just I think it's a practical question, what's easy and what's difficult for you to find faith in, is a question, right? And if you notice, like, some people have a hard time finding faith in anything, right? There are like really great scholars of Buddhism who don't have faith, right? Like, for example, some professors, who they know a lot about, say, Buddhism because it's how they get tenure or something. But if you don't have faith, then it doesn't. I mean, there are some professors who are amazing practitioners, of course, but there are some who are not, don't practice, and they wouldn't say they do. So, but anyway, the point I'm making is that it's good to notice what do you what are, where does faith arise for you? Is it in the, and actually that's just an interesting thing to contemplate, right? If you think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or you think of your teacher versus you think of Tara or the Buddha or Chenrezig, or, the Arhats, or like, just to see like what's your experience like. But if you can cultivate faith, then it decreases your mental afflictions, and it serves as a basis for giving rise to aspiration, right? Aspiration for the qualities that you see in the object of your faith. But so anyway, this first one is like a faith that admires and clarifies, where you kind of feel a sense of joy and respect, not respect, that's just a different word. Where you feel a sense of joy and maybe admiration is a good word, for the excellent qualities of the object of your faith. So that's one. The next one is faith of conviction. That's a faith gained through study and contemplation, where you've studied and contemplated on a certain topic, and then you have a kind of, again, I think confidence is an interesting word. It could be, but faith, confidence or conviction that a certain thing is true. An example might be karma, cause and effect, as it says here, or dependent arising, right? If you contemplate dependent arising, you can come to a point of confidence that things are dependently arisen, right? And again, that also clarifies your mind, and it gives rise to a sense of aspiration. So that's the second one. And now we covered those. We didn't cover this third one. The third one, they call it here wishing faith, or another translator called it longing faith. And I'll read the definition here. Wishing, or the description. Wishing faith is, for instance, having contemplated the modes of the Four Noble Truths, ascertained true sufferings and true origins as objects of abandonment, and true cessations and true paths as object of attainment, and having understood that these can be attained if one makes the proper effort, the faith thinking, I shall definitely obtain them, right? So in this one, you've already contemplated something, right? And come to a kind of conviction that it's true. But here, there's this quality of wishing to attain it, or wishing to obtain it, or wishing to realize it. In Art Engel's translation of the same one, he says, he makes a point, or actually it's, Art's translating it, but it's actually Vasubandhu who makes this point. This is not a kind of craving because it has a virtuous entity for its object, nor is it aspiration because aspiration is preceded by such faith, right? So this is a kind of a wish that gives rise to an aspiration that gives rise to effort, is the idea here. Yeah, I'll just share, like, actually it's funny, just yesterday I was talking with an old friend, and we were talking, he brought the topic of Buddha nature. And he was asking me something about it, we were talking about it, and then he was asking me something, and I remembered, I was like, oh, like, because he practices in the Cognition tradition, so we were sort of saying, oh, there's slightly different interpretations of what is Buddha nature. We were talking about that a little bit, but then what I was saying was, it came from Gyime Khenchen Rinpoche. I've heard him teach many times on Buddha nature, and what I was saying was that I thought, from a practical perspective, the differences in the philosophical view weren't so important. What mattered was, and it's getting at this kind of faith, that, because Khenchen Rinpoche was emphasizing this, that really one of the main points of studying and contemplating Buddha nature is to develop a confidence that you can become a Buddha, right? Because otherwise, how can you generate bodhicitta? Right? There is, how can you generate the wish to become a Buddha if you feel like I'm intrinsically unworthy, or I'm intrinsically afflicted, or I'm intrinsically, what's the word, hopeless, or I'm intrinsically imperfect, then how can you strive to become a Buddha who's perfectly enlightened being, right? So you have to have a kind of faith, right? And it would have to be this kind, wouldn't it? First, the faith of conviction, right? Where you study Buddha nature and you come to conviction. All beings, even bugs, even insects, have Buddha nature, right? And if you come to a conviction in that, then you can come to a conviction, well, I must have Buddha nature, right? And then if you already have compassion for others, right, great compassion, then you could come to this point where you would feel like this, what he's saying here. I shall definitely obtain that state. Right? If it's possible for me to obtain Buddha enlightenment, and I have this kind of nature, if you have a kind of conviction and trust in that or faith in that, then it's possible to develop this wishing, right? And that wishing will then give rise to aspiration, which will then give rise to effort to become enlightened. But if you don't think something's possible, right, then you're not going to make much effort to achieve it, because why would you make effort to achieve something you don't think you can achieve? Okay. So anyways, you get this. So this last one, and you can see how this last one grows out of the previous one, right? First, you have to have a kind of conviction and through study that something's possible. And then once you have a conviction that it's possible to achieve something, then you can develop this wish to achieve it. So it's very psychological at this point. And the example that the text gives, right, is the Four Noble Truths. So you would, in that case, you would, if you, and what he's getting at, right, is, of course, if you contemplate the Four Noble Truths, actually, it's an interesting question. Do you have faith that they're true, right? And I don't know, and it's funny to me, like, again, I just want to emphasize this point I said in the first class about this last week, or last time rather, is, like, so he's giving the example of faith in the Four Noble Truths, right? And I just want, right, in Buddhism, I mean, obviously the Four Noble Truths are the first teaching of the Buddha, right? The core teaching, and all Buddhist teaching, all Buddhist traditions agree that the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. They're foundational. Is that what you would usually think of as faith? I just want to add, like, sometimes we talk, like, sometimes I think that's what Buddhism means by faith. I'm just pointing out, like, sometimes the word faith doesn't necessarily, in English, I don't think, sometimes the way some people use it wouldn't imply, because the Four Noble Truths is something you're supposed to check for yourself, right? The Buddha said, check it from your own experience. Is there suffering? Is there a cause of suffering? Can that cause be decreased and then eliminated or not, right? So the idea is that this is something that you're supposed to be able to check for yourself. So it's a faith, in this case, it's not a blind faith, is my point, right? If you study, like, the teachings on pramana, they make that point. You should be able to check through reasoning, through your experience and reasoning, is it true? And then you develop what? A conviction. That's why I think conviction might be a better word. You can develop a conviction that something's true through your own experience and reasoned contemplation. But anyway, in Buddhism, that's what's faith. That's faith, if that makes sense. That's a kind of faith. So this last one is that faith where you wish to achieve it. I'll just keep going for a minute, and then I'll pause and see if there are questions, because he makes some interesting points here. Then he says, here I have merely identified some illustrations of the three types of faith. It is not that all instances have been exhausted here. And then he says, nowadays in our world, liking and faith are spoken of as if they are the same. And I don't think this is a linguistic issue that apparently comes in Tibetan. I don't think it comes in English, because I don't think people confuse liking with faith necessarily in English, but it's in Tibetan, so it's a Tibetan linguistic issue. But he says, but he's getting at a point, I think, psychologically, where he says, so for example, people can say they have faith in beer, and he's saying, but liking and faith are nevertheless not the same. Faith is an entity, and this is the important point, I think, here. Faith is by entity a virtuous mental factor, whereas liking has both virtuous and non-virtuous factors. If it is explained in detail, there are four possibilities. So I just want to make a point. So what is liking? I just want to, he's drawing a distinction here between two different mental factors. And again, I just want to remind everybody, all of these mental factors are for introspection, right? They're for us to look inside ourselves and check what is my, what's going on in my mind, right? They're for you to check up on your own experience. So here he's getting at a point, which is to differentiate in your own experience between liking and faith. And so to like something, according to the way Buddhism usually defines it, would be one Geshe said, to like something means to enjoy coming across it, or to enjoy having it or interacting with it, right? And he's saying that's not the same as faith, right? And then he gets into detail here. He says something, you can both like something and have faith in it, he gets the four possibilities. So you can like something, but it cannot be faith. You can have faith, but it's not liking. You can have that which is both, and you can have that which is neither. And again, this is just a tool for introspection, but let's go through it briefly. So the first, right, that which is liking but not faith, would be, he gives examples. It would be, he says, for example, liking one's son, liking one's wife, liking a source of misdeeds, such as, getting drunk, or eating meals afternoon if you're ordained, right? What he's getting at there is like, what would be an example of liking something but not having faith in it? If you say, I like beer, you like beer, but that doesn't mean you have faith in it, right? Or if you say, I like my favorite baseball team, right? You like them, but hopefully you don't have faith in them. Actually, it's not faith, actually, because by definition, he said faith is something that that not only exists but has virtuous qualities, right? Has exalted qualities. And so, liking your friend, for example, is an example of liking, but that's not faith. And also part of that is because faith by nature, as he points out here, is a virtuous mental factor, right? So those are just liking, and liking in that sense can be virtuous or non-virtuous, right? As he said. But it's not the same as faith, because faith has this quality of clarifying and the object of faith is something, as it says above, with excellent qualities of realization. So the second one, that which is faith but not liking, he gives the example of fear from the depths of one's depths, and faith of conviction regarding the drawbacks and sufferings of samsara, right? So there you could have faith through contemplation, right? So that kind of faith of conviction that sees the faults of samsara, right, and wants to be free from them, but you don't like, therefore, and by definition, then you don't like samsara. You actually want to be liberated from it. So you could have a kind of faith in and that's a faith in the Dharma, right? It's Dharma teaching, right? There's a teaching of the Dharma that samsara is in the nature of suffering. And if you contemplate that, you can develop a kind of conviction that that's true, but you don't like samsara. So not all faith is liking the object, right? Because that's a Dharma teaching, but it's not, but it's when you look at the object when you look at samsara, you're not liking it. Then there's a faith which is both a faith and a liking, and he gives the example there of faith in one's spiritual guide, and that's where, like, so if you have a spiritual teacher, right? Actually, if you like, there are many examples of this, but if you ever look at the facial expression of you ever been around like Tibetans when and they're actually present and they see the Dalai Lama. So it's the Dalai Lama, right? Like if you look at sometimes it's like you look at the look on the person's face, and it's like quite touching. Where you can see like there's an incredible faith, right, in on the part of that person, and then also there's a joy, right? A joy at liking. They obviously if liking is what's the word? To enjoy seeing them, for sure, it's a liking that's also a faith, right? But if you have a spiritual teacher and you get to see them, right, you can have this feeling of like joy at seeing them, but also the kind of faith, that also, what's the word? Like appreciates their good qualities and maybe wants to achieve their good qualities like theirs, that kind of faith. And then that which is neither faith nor liking gives the example of anger. So if you're angry, you're neither liking something nor having faith in something. So anyway, he's making a point there about the nature of faith. And then he further clarifies. Somebody asked, well, then are liking and respect the same, or are they different? So he's getting, you see, I just want to point this out, right? What he's getting at, it's just like, he's making some specific points here, but I just want to emphasize this here. What he's actually getting at is looking deeply at your own experience, right? And he's saying, like, notice your experience of liking. Right? Now he's raising respect. Notice your experience of respect. And then he's saying, is that the same as or different from faith? And are liking and respect the same as or different from each other? And from a, you know, if you're practicing Dharma, Buddhism, you know, then I think there's an implicit instruction here, which is this is our task, actually, to some extent, right? Is to get to know our own mind and to notice these different mental factors and what they're like. So he clarified what liking is like and then what faith is like. Now he's raising a question about respect. And he says, again, in the world, we speak of them as if they are the same, but in fact, they are not. And then he draws a point where one, it's an interesting point that actually, I think this translation, the phrasing is a little funny, but when one thinks of one's spiritual friend, there could be both liking and faith go together. Then he says, but respect is a different mental factor. So, you know, in general, there's liking, right? Then there's faith, and then there's respect. And he says, respect comes from contemplating the spiritual teacher's kindness, knowing shame, which we'll get into. Shame in this case is not what often in English means shame, but the shame in this case means like wanting to, what's the word? Wanting to live up to that relationship, we'll call it. We'll get into it more later, but and valuing him highly. Hence, when liking and respect arise in the continuum, they are separate mental factors. And so, again, this term respect, you could almost say the respect or almost the kind of reverence, I think, is being described here, which also is there when you see a Tibetan looking at his own Dalai Lama. But so these are different mental factors that can all be present, but sometimes one is present and another isn't. But this quality of respect here is like seeing that the person has done an incredible kindness to you. And, you know, and he says, so valuing them highly. So it's like really feeling like, wow, this, you know, they sometimes give an analogy here of like, when somebody's like on the analogy they sometimes give to this one is like, if someone were on death row and then were given a pardon, you know, then they would, if they, you know, if you imagine the emotion of that person when they look at the person who just pardoned them, some feeling of like valuing them highly and feeling their kindness. What he's saying here is this is the kind of mental state that a person can have towards their guru. That's a particular kind of respect or reverence. And that's a little different than the kinds of faith. And he's just drawing these subtle distinctions between different mental factors is really what he's doing. So we can do that in our own, and as we go along through the mental factors, part of our task is to do that in relation to our own minds, to check out our own minds and to go, what is my mental factor here? And then he says, in accordance with how they appear in the great treatises, right? That means the treatises of India, right? The great treatises by the great Buddhist masters of Balanda monastery. Really, he says, if in accordance with how they appear in the great treatises, you analyze these modes in detail with the wisdom of individual investigation, examining the way in which they are generated in the continuum by turning your mind inwards, then you will get to know them. You cannot know them merely through words, right? So that's what I was just saying in a way, right? That these, and he's making a point that's going to apply, because he's also, this is going to apply to the future, all the mental factors we're covering. Is he saying he's using words? Of course, he has to use words to describe them. But if you want to really understand this, you take those words and then you, like, actually, I would say this, like, if you want to do like a homework assignment, right? So sit down and actually ask yourself, well, okay, given this definition of faith, right? And we're talking about faith as it's defined here in Buddhist texts. Do I have faith? And in what? You know, or in who? Or in, yeah, what are the objects of my faith? And what's it like when I generate faith, right? What does it feel like? And is it true? Like he's saying, when you generate faith, you get a kind of clarity of mind and your turbidity of mind decreases. So check for yourself, right? Don't, like, he just said the words, but what he's saying is that's meditation actually, right? And you'll start to notice like which mental factors are easier for you to give rise to and which are harder. That makes sense. Yeah, and then if you like, yeah, anyway, you get my point, so I won't go on. Anyway, so that's, he's saying you have to look inwards, right, to check out these mental factors. Then he says, with these meanings in mind, the foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa repeatedly advises that in order to perform wholehearted practice, you must rely upon a skillful spiritual friend and acquire much hearing on the meaning of the scriptures. However, so he's saying, what he's getting at there, right, it's interesting. He's saying, if you really want to practice well, you have to study first, because, and he's getting at how do you really practice Buddhism? And it's interesting. This is exactly the way Dalai Lama always is advising, isn't it? Is he saying it's not enough just to hear a few words of and then think you understand it, right? But he's saying, study broadly and then sit and check your own mind against those scriptures, against the Buddhist teachings. And that's how you actually practice, is you study the teachings and then you relate them to yourself and you check, does this fit my experience? Does it not fit my experience? In what way? I remember once, what was like about highest yoga tantra, but the Dalai Lama was once pointing out, he said, like, there, you notice if you studied the great treatises on highest yoga tantra, there's like the Kala chakra describes subtle energies in the body one way, and other tantric teachings like the Chakra Samvara and Guya Samaja describe them a different way. They describe how those energies work in different ways. And then the Dalai Lama was saying that he had been studying one text by a Tibetan master who had gone into retreat. He had read them both, and he'd gone into retreat, and he came out of retreat and he said, my body works like the Kala chakra system. I checked. And the Dalai Lama was saying, that's a real practitioner, right? Whereas he went and he checked his own body, he checked his own experience of energy in his body. And he came out of retreat and he said, so he knew for him, the Kala chakra was the right practice. And then he could say the other ones are for other kinds of practitioners whose bodies, subtle energies work differently. And you have to choose the right system for your body, for your energy in your subtle body or something. And the Dalai Lama was saying, that's how to, it's the same point that's being made here. He's saying, that's how you practice the Dharma, is you see what does the Buddha teach, and then you check it against your own experience. And and then when you see it, when you develop faith through your own experience and a kind of conviction from your own experience and contemplation, then you put that into practice. So that's what our author is saying too. Then he says, however, nowadays, when these great textual systems are explained to foolish beings who are deprived of the gem of intelligence and are inferior in merit, they become frightened, terrified, and flee away, as though a poisonous snake had sensed the odor of musk, or a little child had caught sight of a whirlpool, meaning like they were going to drown, right? So he's kind of, I think he's being a little funny, but what he's getting at here, right, is, people flee. And actually, I don't know, in Tibetan Buddhist circles, that's still true to some extent. Actually, like if you see, I don't know if you actually, if you see that with large teachings by Dalai, but I've noticed that, like for myself, if I organize a teaching, let's say Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche is coming to town, which he sometimes does, right, or other lamas. I've noticed this, like if I sometimes help organize the teaching, right? I've noticed that if I organize like a simple like blessing, like a long life blessing, then there will be quite a good turnout to that. If Khenpo Rinpoche were to give like a white Tara blessing, right, then many people probably would come. Whereas if we said, oh, he's going to teach on the Abhisamaya Alamkara, certain chapter 4 of the, or something, whatever, some chapter of a long text, then there won't be as many people there, right? Like people won't come as much. And the Dalai Lama often says it. He sort of chides me, right? When he gives like some big, often he gives the Kala chakra, which is very beautiful with dancing and rituals and all that. And then usually he'll give like some Dharma teaching beforehand. And then like he'll say, oh, everybody comes late. If he teaches for 4 days on some complex Dharma teaching, then it's like a small audience. And then on the 5th day, when he starts the Kala chakra, suddenly all the people arrive. And then he said, that's really bad. So what our author, Kachin Yeshi Gyaltsen, saying was true back then is still true to some extent, right? I remember when Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche lived in the area, he would teach like sometimes these very detailed textual teachings, and it would be true. Only a few people would come. Whereas if it was like a general talk on love, then more people would come. And again, love is good, but I just think what Kachin Yeshi Gyaltsen is saying is, if you really want to practice, then you have to do both. Then he says, those who view the exalted speech of the great scholars and adepts from the land of superiors, meaning India, as a pith instruction, seem like the stars during the daytime. Right. And so what he's getting at is pith instruction, right? That are, we are, and actually it's true sometimes, right? Like people sometimes want like a pith instruction of practice. And what he's saying is the pith instruction of practice is the great treatises. It's these teachings are the real instruction of how to practice. And that's true. I'm just pointing out, like, that's true even today. Like, I mean, it's not just true in Tibetan Buddhist circles, but I've noticed that, like, so you say it right. Like, actually, I've had that. Oh, just this is funny. I remember one time there was a guy who came to the center numerous times, and this happened a few times, and then he was saying to me, we were studying texts like this a little bit, not this text, but we were studying like, and he was saying, like, you should stop teaching those. Give like a general talk, like on like mindfulness and how to something, whatever it was, like, how to not be stressed out at work or something. And those are good, those are good topics and things like that. But I mean, he was sort of saying, he was arguing for what this text is saying don't do, and that often happens. Like, and again, I'm not against that, and it's good to have things like that. But what this text is saying is, if we really want to make progress in our spiritual practice, then we do what he's describing, which is you study things like your own mental practice, and you sit down and you check your mind. And then you become more and more adept at understanding your mind in a deeper and deeper way. And in a way that's conducive to liberation, actually, is what he's saying, or enlightenment. So then he says, here the function of faith is specified as acting as a support for aspiration, because, as explained above, the cause of all excellent qualities is effort. In order to generate effort, one needs aspiration that seeks. In order to generate aspiration, one needs to see the excellent qualities as well as possess faith of conviction. For this reason, faith is praised more than once as the foundation of all virtuous qualities in the scriptures and their commentaries. And he's going to say a little more about this, but let's pause there. So what's he saying, right? First of all, that's a really interesting point, right? Effort. He says all good qualities come from effort. It's that's disappointing, isn't it? It would be nice if they just happened without effort, but that's not Buddhist view, right? In the Buddhist view, everything comes about through effort, joyous effort, you sometimes say, right? But still effort. And then he's saying effort comes about. He's getting at a psychological point here. Effort comes through aspiration, right? Aspiration, which seeks, right, comes from faith that sees the excellent qualities, right? Through the faith of conviction that sees the excellent qualities. I want to point something out, right? Like, people, it's kind of funny. This is the Buddhist answer. We sometimes say, oh, how do you stop procrastinating? Right? This is the Buddhist answer to that question. Like, this is a very practical point he's making. Whereas actually, how many, people often, right, say, oh, we procrastinate, we put off things that matter. So what he's saying, actually, very clearly, right, is this is the Buddhist answer to how do you not procrastinate, is you see the excellent qualities of something, right? You start to long for it, and then you make, and then you start to make effort towards it. And if you don't, and so what he's saying is, if you're not making effort, it means you don't really see the excellent qualities, or you don't believe it's possible, right? Like, you have to see the excellent qualities of something, and you have to believe it's possible for you to achieve it, right? And you have to start to long for it. Once you've started to long for it, then effort will come, right? So if you're not making effort, I just want to point that out, if you're not making effort towards anything, actually, right, then you can use this as a psychological tool to analyze why. Is it that you don't really see and feel the excellent qualities of the thing? Is it that you think something else is more valuable to you, right? That's okay, but at least check, right? It's saying you must, actually. Or do you not believe that it's possible for you, right? Because even if you see the excellent qualities, if you think that's not possible for me, then you're not going to make effort, right? So this is a very, I just want to point out, this is a guide to working with yourself if you're procrastinating. And you can actually apply this guide to any procrastination, but particularly to spiritual procrastination, right? So if you're not making effort in your own inner spiritual work, then you can check, well, which is it? And Yeah, I remember that once, years ago. I was like checking that. I was realizing like I was meditating on I'm just sharing an example. I was meditating on bodhicitta, and I realized I have a lot of faith. I was realizing like I have a great trust in the power of compassion. Like I believe compassion is wonderful. I have I was like, oh, I have faith that enlightenment is wonderful. Like I believe that. And then I was realizing, but I didn't believe it was possible for me. Like there was this part of me that didn't really believe. I was like, yeah, enlightenment's great, and these enlightened beings like the Buddha are great, compassion's great. But when it came to like the idea that I could become like that, I didn't really trust that. So I was like, oh, I have to think about Buddha nature more. That's what I was saying earlier, right? And that you won't make effort if there's something getting in the way is the point, right? I'm just giving an example. I wasn't making effort in a certain way because I didn't trust. I hadn't. There was an obstacle to effort. And so what this is saying is, whenever you're not making effort, it's something that you want to make effort towards, which is then what we say procrastination. You can use this as a guide, right? Check for yourself what's getting in my way. Yeah. Anyway, so that's that. And then he's going to now what's the word? Advertise. Say, he's going to elaborate on that. So he says, faith is. He quotes a sutra, the formula of the three jewels blaze. Faith is the forerunner, and like a mother, it is the procreator. It guards and increases all excellent qualities. It dispels doubts and frees you from the four great rivers. It describes what they are below. I can say later. Faith signifies the city of happiness and goodness. Faith is without murkiness and clarifies the mind. It abandons pride and is the root of respect. Faith is a jewel, a treasure. It is the best of feet, right, to take you where you want to go. Like hands, it is the root of gathering virtue. Right. So he's making this point that faith is that fundamental to our effort. And again, I just think it's important here. Like if you read that quote, but you don't know what faith is, it could seem like, anyway, then it's not clear, right? But go back, right? Faith is a kind of conviction, right, through contemplation in the value, and that it's and then this wishing faith, right? So particularly, I think this is wishing faith. So it's this idea that you have contemplated and see, wow, this has some goal, some spiritual goal in this case, has value, is wonderful, and it's possible for me to achieve that, right? And what he's getting at, so this is not some kind of like, oh, faith, just have faith. It's saying, if you understand that, then you'll make effort, right? And if you make effort, then good things will come about. So it's not a vague idea here. It's getting at a very specific kind of psychological process. Then he quotes the 10 Teaching Sutra, so another sutra. Faith is the best of vehicles through which you will be guided and definitely emerge. Therefore, intelligent people rely on following faith. Wholesome qualities do not grow in people who have no faith, just as green sprouts do not grow from seeds scorched by fire. I'll just finish this paragraph. Then he says, thus all wholesome qualities are companions of faith. Shanti Deva's Compendium of Training says, having made firm the root of faith, also teaches that faith is the root of all paths. Even the great being, the protector Nagarjuna, emphatically taught that faith is the foundation of all paths. With these meanings in mind, the foremost of Nishin Tsongkhapa made the statement, training in faith, the root. So he's saying faith is the root from which everything grows. One of the outlines of the Lamrim Chenmo stated, the root of all happiness and goodness is the faith of conviction. Right? And again, like he's not saying, I just want to be clear, the faith of conviction is not blind faith, right? It's a faith that comes through contemplation, right? So it's a faith. And again, I'm sort of hesitant with the word faith personally. I think, you know what it means now because we defined it. I would say conviction or confidence, right? You say a confidence, I don't know, whichever word you want, but a kind of conviction or a confidence, right? It's a conviction or a confidence that something's possible, right? I'm going to step back just for it. Like, I'm just thinking of like kids in school, right? Like, because one thing is like, actually, I've seen so often, I work as a psychologist. Sometimes it's parents are trying to convince their kids that like education is valuable. Some kids who aren't doing well in school you have to convince them that it actually has some use, right? And that was probably always had its challenges. And nowadays, I think it's even harder, because some kids quite reasonably say, well, what's the use of, look at global warming. Why do I care? Or something like that, or look at, they say the country, is it going to be value? So you have to convince a child first, like, is there value in an education? But then even if you convince them there's a value in education, if they believe that, then do they believe they're capable, right? Because in other words, those, you have to have both, right? In other words, so if a child believes, let's say a child does think, oh yeah, that'd be good, I'd like to have this career and I need education for that or something or other, but if they don't think they're capable of that, then they're not going to make effort still. And what this is getting at is we're the same, right? In our spiritual students, we're like that. I was using a metaphor, right? But we're similar, right? You have to first, so like if a Buddhist teachings are saying to you, these goals are amazing and you can achieve them. First of all, do you believe they're actually of value, right? And secondly, do you believe you can achieve them? And if not, then why would you make effort at them, right? You're not going to, or you won't make a genuine effort. So that it's getting at, actually, I just want to point out, this whole issue of faith is getting at a very psychological analysis of how one progresses. And it's like the foundational one. So that's why it comes first in these 11. All right, well, that ends up. Any questions on faith before we go on?
I'd just say it's really helpful, Lauren. Thank you for that whole perspective on how faith is the bedrock of moving forward in our practice and our effort. Yeah.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's a very, if you look at it carefully, it's a very psychological analysis of how we go forward in our effort, or how people don't. If people don't, then it's very clear here something, you can check which one, but there are only a few possible obstacles in this one, for the faith part, and you can check which one it is. So I think it's very practical. And then Sujata has.
I'm just noticing that there's a way in which it's easier for me to have, and I'm wondering if it is actually faith in the broader ultimate outcome. Like, we all have Buddha nature, we can all get enlightened, and therefore I can get enlightened. And then procrastination around particular practices, which I think the root of it might be a lack of faith that I'll see significant improvement in this lifetime, or who knows, so. And it feels a little bit neurotic, like that it's a self-flagellating or a lack of faith in myself. And so I'm just curious about whether or not I do actually have faith in the ultimate outcome if I don't even have faith in the steps, right? Like, if I don't even think that I'm going to get, shamatha in this lifetime or whatever, then why do I really think I'm going to get enlightened, anytime soon, et cetera? Or, particularly with like the Tantrayana, right? We say in one lifetime, but then like what kind of belief would be required in one's actual capacity to do so in one lifetime to enter that? And then, I don't know, I'm just noticing that sort of there feels in myself a big disconnect between this, what I thought before this moment was an absolute belief that, in the great enlightenment, that we all can be enlightened, that I can be enlightened, that I will be enlightened someday, even I say those things, right? But then like the individual practices. So I don't know, maybe it was more of a reflection, but I'm curious if, there's more instruction around that particular foible.
Yeah, I think actually, sure, I think that's totally, that you are getting at an issue of faith then, right? Like that you have a kind of, we all can have that, right? And it's, what's there to say, right? Like, it's getting at the second two types of faith, right? Like, is there a clear conviction, in the practices, right? Because those practices are the Dharma, right? The Dharma jewel. So you could say, is there a clear conviction that those practices will bring about their result, right? And then, if not, then you won't get the wishing faith, right? The longing faith won't arise because there's not. And part of that, I was thinking of, there's a Sakya teaching that Islam sometimes uses, because he gets at this interesting point. One is like you have to, it's getting at the teachings from Pramana, first of all, like that we would apply, like, how do you do the reasoning? to see, like, in other words, how do I know that those practices can bring about a result? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because like there are certain practices where you say, okay, so that like the Dharma jewel says that this practice will bring about this kind of result in practice, right? But you could actually ask the question, well, why would I believe that? Right? Like, why would I believe that that practice will bring about that result for me? And so the Sakya teaching says, emphasizes this point that actually at the beginning, it is a little bit of a blind faith. And what they're saying is, like, if you start to practice and you start to experience the result, you experience some level of the result, then you can develop more faith or trust or conviction that the next step is that the next result will happen. Like, so for example, with calm abiding, you use that as an example. Like, there are 9 levels of concentration that are taught in the teachings that one goes through in developing calm abiding. And it's an interesting point, isn't it? Like, so if I haven't yet achieved the first, for example, and then somebody tells me, oh, there are 9 levels of concentration that you go through. Actually, I've had this experience where you read that and I think, well, it's a little like reading science fiction or something. Like, you can read science fiction, and go, oh, that's cool. But I don't know, it seems pretty distant for, like, it's cool that you can have whatever, I don't know, that you can fly to other planets in this science fiction book, and it's cool that people can walk through walls when they develop calm abiding, I don't know, whatever. Like, they will seem cool and kind of like reading Tolkien or something, I don't know, whatever. Like, it seems like really a cool thing to read about, but it seems a little disconnected. But then if you think about it, if you achieve, say, the second of the 9 levels of concentration on the path to calm abiding, well, then your conviction that the third exists experientially would be quite strong. And if you achieve the 5th or 6th, then your conviction becomes even stronger. So what they're getting at in a way in that teaching is, how do you develop this kind of faith in the Dharma jewel? And that part of it has to be through actually experiencing results. And that's where the great treatises come in. So if you've studied the details of the stages that one goes through in any given practice, and then you start to experience the first step and the second step, whether it be calm abiding or in Tantra, right? Like, again, if our knowledge of Tantra, this is what I sometimes had this, actually, like, I've had that experience, maybe, like, where, actually, I remember one time, I was actually, I met Sujata at Vajrapani Institute first. And I remember one time I was at Vajrapani, and I was talking to, I won't say the name, but, somebody I knew who was older than me and had been involved in Tibetan Buddhism for longer than I had. And then he was saying something about Tantra, and I realized, like, oh, he never, like, I mean, he'd received various initiations and, was a wonderful person. But, like, he hadn't gotten the teachings on the stages of practice. And so it was like, I just felt so sad. I was like, oh, he didn't know if he was making progress, because he'd never gotten to sit and listen to detailed great treatises, as this text is describing, on how you progress. So he had a wrong understanding. So then how could he have faith that it would bring about a result, because he didn't know what the stages were of how the result is supposed to happen? And that wasn't, it wasn't anybody's fault. It just hadn't happened the right way. And then I was like, oh my goodness, so you're involved with something for 40 years, but you don't really know from the great treatises how it's supposed to work. So then you don't know if it's working. And then I was thinking, oh wow, but if you've studied in detail, then okay, these are the gradual stages of how you practice, of how you progress in highest yoga tantra, for example, because you were giving the example of enlightenment in one lifetime. So then if you go, okay, wow, so I've achieved like this part, if you see the great treatises on how to practice given tantra, say you progress in this way, and then you say, okay, I've achieved this first 2 parts, or they're described, so the next one should be achievable. And then you can develop this kind of trust. Now, but if you say, well, it's an interesting point though, right? If you start to say, how can I develop trust that, if you read some of the things on the completion stage, it's like the 9th level of calm abiding, it's more advanced than that even. It's hard to have faith in that, because it seems, again, like so far from our experience. But you can imagine, this is what that teaching was getting at, as you progress in those and get closer to it, because the previous ones have worked, then you start to see, oh wow, okay, that's how it works. And now I can see from my own experience, like that guy who Khedrup Norsen Gyatso was the one who did the Kala Chakra retreat. Once he actually saw, wow, this says you take this many breaths. The text said this, you breathe this many times a day. And when in the morning, your breath is more through this nostril. But then after this hour, it'll shift to that nostril. And then it'll become even. And then if you do this, your breathing will change in this way. So he watched his breath, like at that level of specificity. And he was like, wow, this text, like I never knew I breathed more from one nostril than the other at all. But then you go on a retreat and you start to notice, wow, like the text is describing how I've been breathing my entire life that I never noticed. And it's exactly like that. And when I do this practice, my breathing changes, just like it says it will. It says if you do this practice, then this will happen to your breath. And then this will happen next. And he started watching that happen, experientially. And he looked at another text. He said, no, it's not like that one. It's like this one. Well, you can see how that person would develop conviction in that tantra then, because he saw, oh, it exactly describes what happens in my body and my experience. So then he started to develop, but if you don't do that, then it's just like, again, I think it's like you read the Kala Chakra and it's like reading, a fantasy novel or a science fiction novel. It's like, oh, wow, how cool. But how can you have faith that that's true unless you've checked your own body and your own experience with meditation and so on? So that's how I think that happens.
I want to just ask a quick follow-up question. And it's particularly around like this thing that the story you've told. I think that the aha moment I'm having right now is related to this Kala Chakra story, and the self-awareness that this person has. Could you say his name again?
I think it was Khedrup Norsen Gyatso, who was like a teacher of one of the Dalai Lamas. He was a great Kala Chakra. Actually, there's a book translated. I think Jimpa's series has one of his, somebody's translated one of his texts on Kala Chakra, I think, but he was a great yogi of the Kala Chakra, and he was one of the teachers of the early Dalai Lama. I think he was a student of one Dalai Lama and a teacher of another. It might have been the student of the first Dalai Lama and a teacher of the second or something. I can't remember exactly.
Wonderful. Yeah. And so there's a piece where there's so many different approaches, even within our own lineage. And the lack of self-awareness that I have about which of the many practices I should be drilling down into, right? Is just, I think I'm realizing that I eschew, in some ways, spending a lot of time thinking about myself, and that feels narcissistic. But there was something so beautifully refined about the way you were describing being in deep connection with which nostril the breath is coming out of, that I think here in the West, this like self-care thing has become, or Buddhism is self-care, mindfulness is self-care. Like I really want to stay away from that stuff. And I think there's a way in which I've gone too far in that direction, and I'm not spending enough time understanding, that you need to look at yourself. It's kind of all connecting to that. All the teachings are personal instructions, right? And that's not narcissistic, in order to understand which of these many routes up the mountain are the ones that are most possible for me. Like that's, I don't know. I think I'm sitting with that. That's the biggest thing, but to even be able to start to have faith in the bigger picture, this faith in the capacity to go up one of these routes, and the self-awareness that needs to be there. So I don't think I have a question in there, but just thank you. This is very helpful.
No, I think your comment's wonderful. Yeah. I think, and then I don't know who had their hand up. There's Wilhelmina or Lynn, either of you who wants to go first, whatever. I guess, Wilhelmina, do you want to go first? You're already unmuted, I think.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm ready.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about faith and how I got to where I am. And the main thing was for me that now 30 some years ago, I had an earth moving experience. I came to a realization that, wow, all I've done is that for nothing. And I had an existential quest that I said to whoever it was, I was a Catholic at the time, whoever it was, I've done everything I needed to do, I think, as best as I could. And look, I came here to do something good, and look at what's happening. It's all falling apart. And if I don't get an answer to my question, then I'm out of here. I need to know what the heck is going on, because I can't do this over and over again. I've done my best. And since that day, I have been guided so deeply. I had to give up my Catholicism because I couldn't find enough in there that could hold me. And I had studied it, and I went to study groups apart from the practices, and it didn't work. So I had to let that go. And then I fell into this big hole. And I had to sit at the river on the rocks, the Potomac River, and get my strength back because I couldn't breathe. And I think that is what has given me. And then I took almost 8 years to find spiritual paths that I found joy in, but I knew that I wasn't yet home. I had to get home, and I wasn't home yet. It was nice, but it wasn't really me. And then finally, I came with Jean to your first teaching that I did when you had first come out, and you were talking about Lama Tsongkhapa, and I was with Jean, and I was home. I had gone to all the different lineages, and that was nice, but I wasn't home yet. And then finally, when I got to you, the fourth lineage, I could breathe. And after so many years, then to Kenso Rinpoche appeared, and then he was my real heart teacher. And so that faith for me of having to struggle to find where I was looking for, and that I was guided, and that I could trust how I'm being guided. And then I got to a point that I thought, well, I'm coming back to this earth to help, because that was my first teaching with the Dalai Lama, where we went together to New York. And then I have lived in that belief for a long time. And then when you taught the last year that monks who all of a sudden find out that they were not in the path that they thought they were. And I had just had an inclination that for me, and also a conviction of myself, that I had tried to do all the practices that Lama Zopa had given me, my lifelong practices, which were mainly about purifying. And so in the 2018, there was a teaching, and I said to Kume Kenso Rinpoche, I can't go any further because I first need to clean more. And he said, go clean. So I kept on cleaning, but it was a long time of cleaning. So I couldn't really concentrate so much on the teachings yet because I wasn't clean enough. And then finally, now I'm getting to the point that I realize that I can't come back yet because I haven't achieved that, but I can achieve something else. I can go to the Pure Land. So now I'm getting to understand that is where I'm supposed to go. And Kume Kenso Rinpoche gave teachings on how to go for my specific deity. And that is, and I still have all the notes from it that I wrote out. So I hope that is enough. But it's a real long quest, and it can take all sorts of turns. And I'm about almost 84 now, and I still play. And I'm doing another practice now that helps me too, that has been given to me, that also Kume Kenso Rinpoche taught about the 4 mindfulnesses. And that works. And I'm so excited. And I sometimes can't get my breath because my breath is changing. My head, my brain is changing. And it's a lot to work with, but I know that I'm being guided. And that is for me the greatest gift that I could have ever given. And I'm so happy I went through that experience. I just wanted to share this to show that it's possible, that faith is really the most important part of the whole of understanding, of the whole of getting where you really want to go, and that there is no other way about it. For me. So thank you for listening. I really am so happy to get the chance to, because of the people where we are with, to share that with. And that it takes a long time and you can get old, but I pray that I can have a longer life, and I do everything for that to finish what I'm supposed to do here. So thank you.
Thank you, Willem. I don't have much to say, but I'll just say one quick thing. Like I mean, Wilhelmina mentioned it, but I think it's been like about 25 years. So when you said 30 years ago, I think we met about 25 years ago, Wilhelmina.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, it took me a long time to get from my 50s to my 58. And when I got there, then I met you. And then I was ready. All at the right time.
Well, and to me, actually, just one thing I'll say is I think, for me anyway, knowing you for 25 years, I think you're a beautiful example of the power of faith and how it produces effort, because your effort has been like a steady river. And even when you've been exhausted or have, challenges of health or something, you always make effort. And that is clear. I mean, it's exactly what Ketchen Yelshi Gelson's text is saying, is that your deep faith leads to incredible sustained effort over so long, and doing those practices that Lama Zopa Rinpoche taught you and practices Gyumei Khenso Rinpoche taught you. So to me, your life is an example of what Ketchen Yelshi Gelson is saying, which is that faith leads to aspiration, which leads to effort. You've done that for many, many years, and still doing
it. I can't do anything else.
So I think your life is teaching the same thing as this paragraph. So to me.
Well, this was a good moment for me to express it, I think.
Thanks for sharing it. I think it helps people, including me. Oh, and then Lynn, Lynn wants to say something.
This was very similar, what Wilhelmina shared, to what I was thinking. I was raised Catholic as well. And faith is totally different in the Catholic religion. You believe in the Trinity, everything is up there. There's no reasoning, there's no sort of organic understanding that leads you to faith. And the wonderful thing about Buddhism is you have faith, but you understand how you know what you know. I mean, it's epistemology, but on a simple basis, you develop a thinking and logic and understanding that leads you to your faith. So it's a totally different kind of faith than the faith in, say, the Catholic Church. I don't know about other religions, but certainly Catholicism. And I've always been struck at how many people that were Catholic come to Buddhism, because I think there's a lot of us. So it's always been really interesting to me that there's a hardcore of ex-Catholics or former Catholics, however you want to say it. But I think what Buddhism does is it gives you the underpinnings and sort of you get to your faith in a sort of an organic way. It's not just believe this because it is. So it's a very, it's a more solid, organic kind of faith. John. Probably.
That's interesting. Yeah, I find it so valuable. Even, I mean, to have the faith defined and explained in the, just at least what the term means in this, in a given tradition. Yeah. But also, it's great to hear people's individual experiences. Wow. Well, any other comments on faith?
I just have one more small thing to say, based on what Lynn just shared, which this class is like filled with epiphanies. And first, I'm so moved. Wilhelmina, I just, being 51 and hearing that you started your path now, in terms of my age, really on this is just very beneficial to me. So thank you. I was in tears the entire time you were speaking. So it was super beneficial for me. And I'm just thinking about faith, it's interesting, just needing to name sort of, when are we sort of more gentle with ourselves? So my experience, I come to this differently from a background in Hinduism and having practiced. And one of the things that I think I really struggled with regard to faith on that journey was that there's a practice where you're like looking for, you sort of dissolving the same way that we're dissolving ourselves here, where we're looking for, it's not this, it's called the neti practice, where it's not the aggregates, it's not this, it's not that. What is it? And you're supposed to keep going. And if you do it well enough, you're going to come to the answer that it's your Atman, right? It's the self, it's the big S self. And, I tried, and I was a kid and I didn't do it long enough. And the answer was always, if you don't have sufficient faith because, you just haven't gotten there yet. And so it's just interesting to me that, when do you see results and when do you lose faith? I think is my question about like, how hard do we drive ourselves on some practice? For me, it was a practice that ultimately, I don't like to be critical of other religions because I think all the paths are beneficial to people. But for me personally, Hinduism in retrospect felt like gaslighting. Like, keep looking and you'll find it. And you can't find it because you're not enlightened enough. And if you looked harder, you'd find the big S self, right? But so for me, there's a hangover there that is like, if I'm trying something and the results aren't coming, I lose faith in myself because I just haven't tried hard enough. Does that make sense? And so I lose faith in my own capacity if I've been doing a practice for a really long time. And so I'm just curious about that piece of this. Lauren, I think I'm asking you to cross over from your Dharma teacher role into your psychologist role at this point, but just some advice on sort of when are we, pushing ourselves to, when not having that response, which I wrote down the words, that works. And I'm so excited, it's like, it's not working and it's not working and it's not working. And now I'm losing faith, both maybe in myself and in the goal. How do we play with that? How do we work with that?
First I'll say, ultimately, I don't know actually, but actually, I'll just share. This actually came out of that same conversation I mentioned I was having yesterday. It really made me think last night. I was sort of contemplating on this because, I won't share a name, but one time I remember this effect. I'm sharing it not about my friend, but about me actually. Like one time I was at a teaching. It was after a friend of mine had just finished like a 3-year retreat, and I was at a teaching with them, and it was a large, huge public event and it was the Dalai Lama, so it was like a huge venue and all that. And at one point, the Dalai Lama happened to say something like, some people in Tibetan Buddhist tradition do 3-year retreat. Who cares? There's no meaning at all. He kind of was very and he said, what matters is somebody's mental afflictions less, is they have more compassion and more love. He said, I'm not impressed if somebody's done 12 years of retreat. Who cares? But if somebody has less anger and less, and my friend started crying, feeling like, I failed. I spent 3 years in the middle of the woods for nothing, and it was wasted time. Like kind of feeling like, they got over it, but Eventually, it was actually helpful, but at the time it really struck me, because that I was like, I mean, I was friends with that person because we had a lot in common in part, and one of the things we had in common was like, there's somebody who like, did well in school and is smart and works hard and does what's expected of them, and like, sort of, and like they had, I wasn't there in the retreat, I have no idea what really happened, but I was like, oh, I mean, I related in the sense of like, I don't know, like you get an assignment and you go do it, you do it, you get an A or something. And I think they had done like an A-level retreat or something. And because they had done it right, in a sense. And I think the tears to me were, I think actually, I mean, I saw the person transform after that, like not just through that comment, but it was like, they reached a point, I think, after that of who cares? Like, in other words, not who cares about Dharma practice, they care deeply about Dharma practice, but like they stopped. It's like, it's the difference between trying to do it, like, you know what I mean? Trying to get an A or something, or trying to do it in a certain way, like that, oh, look, I did it and I checked all the boxes and I said this many mantras and I did this many of this and that many of that, or something, whatever it was for them. I don't know what it was, but to what the Dalai Lama was saying, and I remember Kenta Rinpoche said that when I was in the middle of a retreat once, and then he came and said, again, he wasn't talking to me only, but he was giving a talk, but he said, he said, I don't care if you do a retreat, if you have a vision of the deity, if you have dreams of the deity, it has no meaning at all. Who cares? And he said, but if you have less mental afflictions and more compassion, then that's really good. That's the only sign of a successful retreat. And it wasn't only about retreat, it was like, he was making a point of, that's the only sign of successful Dharma practice. And sometimes I'm in this like tension where then like, also if he gives an initiation, there's a commitment to do a practice, sadhana sometimes or something. And like, there's a part of me that'll be like, well, I got the commitment, so of course I'm going to do that. And, I'll do it every day properly or something. But then it becomes a different question. Is how I'm doing that actually decreasing my mental afflictions, or am I just doing it because, what's the word? Like, because I'm a good student or something. And the good student is useless. That's what, that's what the Dalai Lama and Kenta Rinpoche are saying, like, who cares? Like, so it's an interesting paradox. They're saying on the one hand, there's a commitment, so do it. On the other hand, they're saying, if you just do it because there's a commitment and you're not changing your inner experience of the mental afflictions versus the virtues, then it's a total waste of time, which is kind of funny. So the measure is, it's an interesting point, right? From an experiential perspective, the only measure is it decreasing my anger, my pride, my jealousy, my craving, is it increasing my love, my compassion, my concentration, my wisdom, and so on, patience. And so I think somehow we have to, anyway, I don't know, your question just made me think of all that, like that. It's like a very brave question though, right? To say the only thing that matters is it bring about, can I see progress in that in my own mind, in these results? And if not, then even if I'm doing it right, I'm doing it wrong. Or even if, I'm doing it right in some external way, it's not working, actually. It's not, it has to bring about those changes or it's not functioning. I'll just share one more reflect that, how did he say it? One time Lama Zopa, I was at an event, Lama Zopa, and this really struck me. He said something like, I can't remember how he put it. First, one time he said, we shouldn't, he said, well, don't stop doing the Dharma that you pretend to practice, was one point. It was like, that was, because at least it's better than nothing, but it's not real practice yet. And then he said something like, it was something, I can't remember, I'm gonna forget the phrasing now, but he said something that was like, oh, sometimes Buddhists like are doubly fake or something. It was like some point like that where it was like, it was a critique of a certain way of practicing that I was doing at the time. So that's why it struck me, where it was like, like, anyway, what he was getting at was the same point that like Ken Surmshan and Dalai Lama were getting at, which is like, if it's not really changing our heart, then it's not the correct approach. And it's hard though, like to actually ask, is this working? And do I have to change how I'm doing it in some way? And is my approach not the right approach sometimes? And I'm not saying that's true of you, Sujata, but it's been true of me over and over again. Like, where I have to kind of stop and go, oh, I'm taking the wrong approach, and I'm being like, I'm going through where I'm going through the motions of a certain practice without it having the intended effect. And then what's going wrong? Because, that's, and is it that it's the wrong practice for me? Or is it that I'm not doing the practice correctly? Or what is it, is the question. That is the different answers at different times, but. I don't know if that gets at what you were even asking about, but those are personal.
It was really helpful. It's very helpful. Thank you.
I'll go to the next. So, I'll share like next. There's a translation issue I want to bring up because I struggle with this one, and this is probably because I work as a psychologist. The next one is shame, right, of the virtuous mental factors, and it's kind of funny in English because, and again, I don't know. I mean, there are different meanings of different words in English, but I so often am working with people in therapy where they're trying to stop feeling shame or get past their shame or let go of their shame. So for me, I struggle with that word choice a bit. One translator uses the word conscience, which is I have an easier time with personally. And Geshe Rabten, which I like his the best, actually. Geshe Rabten's book, which I've often quoted, he used the term self-respect, which I really like for this one personally. So I liked that translation of this. That was how his book translates this mental factor, self-respect. So what is either shame or self-respect? The text asks, right? And this is from the Abhidharma. And then it says, it is an avoidance of misdeeds on account of oneself. It has the function of acting as a support for the effective restraint from misconduct. And just to clarify, like, so what's, when I'm, first of all, that it just, I'll say as a side point, the psychological one, right? When I'm working with people and where they're trying to let go of shame, that's not this mental factor, right? Like, or is that word, when shame is used in the way that I was using it in that context, it's a kind of global, what's the word, self-attack, a global feeling bad about oneself that actually doesn't serve as a function. It's not this mental factor, it's a different thing. And it doesn't actually stop people from misconduct, it actually enhances misconduct. So that's a different mental factor. But here, I'm going to call it self-respect because I like that. So self-respect is an avoidance of misdeeds on account of oneself. It has the function of acting as support for the effective restraint from misconduct. Art's text translates it, has a section that says, it is an embarrassment about objectionable acts for reasons related to oneself or to the Dharma. It restrains one from doing objectionable acts, and objectionable acts are those which lead to suffering, which is interesting. So it's stopping you from doing things that would cause you harm or others harm. And in brief, it's thinking something like, I won't do this negative action. It's actually, this is why I think it's self-respect is a reasonable term. So it's actually a mind, just to clarify, leaving aside all the English connotations of shame, and let's get into what is the text, what is the actual Buddhist teaching getting at. What it's getting at is that you restrain yourself or stop yourself from doing negative things that would bring suffering to yourself or others out of a sense of, out of a concern, out of, not, in this case, it's out of, how does he say it? On account of oneself. I like, that's fine. That part of the transition I like. So what does that mean? It means, let's say you're going to do something wrong, something hurtful. You pause and you think, that's not who I am. I'm not somebody who does that. I'm not going to do that. Or you think, wait a second, I'm practicing Dharma. I'm not going to do that, right? Or you think, I value compassion. That would be harmful. What am I, like, I can't do that. Like, you know, so on account of oneself means you're thinking, or, you know, so you're thinking something, what's there you say, right? It's like, it is a kind of sense of self-respect. It's like, somebody could say like, oh, I'm supposed to be better than that, so I won't do that. You know, you know, right, if somebody, I'll give an example. If somebody provokes you and you want to retaliate, right, and then you stop and you think, wait a second, like, that's not who I am, that's not who I want to be. Or you think, I took the bodhisattva vow, you know, like, I'm not going to act that way or something. Any reason that's related to yourself is the point. So it could be, and it could be just that sense of self-respect, but it could also be based on the teachings in karma. You know, so if you think, well, if I do this action, it will create a negative karma and I'm going to suffer, so I'm not going to do it. That would be another example, right? So any reason, so it's where you have some kind of situation where you could do a negative action, right? But then for some reason, in this case, on account of oneself or in relation to oneself, one has an inner process where you stop, right? And again, it could be because you think that's not who you want to be. It could be because you value compassion, so you don't act that way. It could be because you understand karma and you think, I don't want to suffer in the future, so I'm not going to do this behavior, even though I could, or I'm tempted to. You know, it could be also the other, yeah, anyway, because if you think, because I took a promise or a vow not to do that, right? If you think I made a commitment, yeah, actually, like for me, I think, if I take like precepts sometimes, you know, where you fast, like, you know, sometimes there's a practice where you do a day of fasting, right? Well, then sometimes you get hungry and you want to eat, right? But then you think, no, I took a commitment for this day not to eat. I'm not going to eat. I made a vow not to do that. You know, so I keep my promises. I keep my commitment. That would be this mental factor. Does that make sense? So it's a sense of out of respect for yourself, on account of yourself, that you stop yourself from doing something negative. Yeah, I think self-respect, it's a reason one, or conscience maybe is okay. I'm not sure what word to use, but anyway, you get the idea. And anytime you stop yourself from doing something negative, as it says here, shame is so this mental, I'm going to leave out the word shame, self-respect, conscience, whatever, is avoidance of misdeeds on account of oneself. So that's pretty clear. And the reasons can range and can be varied, but it's a virtuous mental factor because actually part of the point here is it's mental, right? It's a mental state of recognizing I made a commitment to not do that, or I don't want to do that, or I'm not somebody who should do that, or I have these values that mean I won't do that. You know, so if you clarify, what are my values? Am I living according to them? That's this, right? That's this mental factor. I know what my values are, and I'm not going to, even if people tell me I should, you know, sometimes people say, oh, you should do this, right? And if you think, no, I know what my values are, I refuse to do it, even if people tell me I should, right? That would be this mental factor, right? Yeah, anyway, that's clear. And then I'm going to do the next one too, because they're related. Oh, sorry, Sujata, you go first. Go ahead.
It's about both of them. And the avoidance thing is confusing to me as a mental state. So isn't a mental avoidance? It seems like these things, conscience, embarrassment, both of them would be supports for the avoidance. Or is it a mental avoidance? I think because I think, yeah, it feels like those are like shame and embarrassment are both things that would be mental states that would support an avoidance. I'm having trouble understanding shame as the avoidance. I feel like shame is the thing that I would feel, or self-respect, conscience, whatever, all of those, embarrassment, the thing that I would feel that would support my avoiding a thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a mental state. It's clearly, I mean, it's a mental factor. And like, go back to my example, like I'll just use a simple example, right? Like you know, if I'll give the example of precepts, right? That's a simple one, right? So like, if I took a precept to not eat after noon, right? And then there comes a point in the evening where you suddenly feel hungry and you think, oh, I'd like a whatever, I'd like to eat X. So that feeling arises of liking to, you think, oh, there's that, oh, in the kitchen there's this. So it's a feeling, right? And then there's I think this would be the mental state that says, there's a state of mind where that comes up that's like, oh wait, I took precepts. I made a promise to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas this morning, before dawn. I kneeled and I made this promise to, and I'm not somebody who, if the feeling is, I don't break it's a feeling of, I don't break that kind of promise, right? That feeling then, and that feeling, you're right, it serves as support. It would stop you from getting up and going to the kitchen or something. Or in the same way, right? Because there's an auxiliary bodhisattva vow, I accept apologies, right? That so if you took the bodhisattva vow and somebody apologizes, you accept their apology, right? And it would be like that. So say you're mad at somebody, they did something, and then they apologize, and there's a feeling, I don't want to accept their apology. I want them to feel bad, right? More. And then if I'm that person, I remember, oh wait, that's an auxiliary bodhisattva vow. I don't, in other words, I took, and you feel, I don't want to be somebody who doesn't fulfill the aspirations of a bodhisattva, act like a bodhisattva. And then even though there's this impulse not to, you say, I accept your apology, you accept it, and there's a feeling though that comes first where you feel this mental state. Oh, I don't want to do that, or I can't do that, or that's not, it goes, so it's an inner state that then leads to the behavior, right? So it's an inner state of mind that you could say, probably more accurate, that leads to an avoidance of misdeeds. Or I guess it could be a misdeed that's mental, but even then it would lead to it, wouldn't it? So yeah, I think you're right, actually. And John, comment.
Yeah, could it be back to when you said earlier, when we talked about the word, what were the exact words? Faith and what were you comparing it to? That it may be, the question about faith and liking. That could it just be a translation issue? Because shame, when I think of English words, I don't think of shame as a virtuous mental factor. I don't think of it as a positive thing. I think we associate the word shame with something negative in most English-speaking cultures. So could it just be a language issue? That because the definition makes sense, but maybe the descriptive word doesn't.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I would personally, for me, I would use the word self-respect. That's in another book, and I prefer that. So for me personally, I would, when I think of this one, I say self-respect. For myself, if I'm contemplating it, I use self-respect because I think that's for me, that works better to get at what the definition is. But use whichever word you want. But yeah, for me, that word works better. That phrase, that's two words, self-respect. But that phrase works better, or conscience, but use whichever one. But I agree with you, it is a linguistic issue. And then Sujata, did you want to say something?
I'm curious about the Sanskrit on this, which I looked up. It's the word hri, which is, I'm just curious because often it's very similar to other, Indian language words. In particular, my mother tongue is very close to Sanskrit. And the negative words for shame that we talk about in English are things like, they're different. They're lajja and ulshik, and they're like all these really like shame on you and you shameful person. And, and there is an implication of like a person with self-respect. To be shameless is a person who lacks self-respect. There's some implication in there in my mother tongue, but the Sanskrit root is not related to any of those negative words, which is interesting. So I want to spend a little bit more time digging into what is the Sanskrit word on this exact Tibetan term, and does it actually align more? It seems like it might align more with, like a positive state. Obviously it's a positive state, right? So that was interesting to me, that the root didn't tie to the negative senses of shame that exist in other words in Indic language.
Oh, please share if you, that's interesting, and please share if you do learn more about that, please share it with us next class or something really interesting to hear more. Well, and then the next one is very related, so I'll just mention it too. Yeah, so the next one they translate as embarrassment, or arts text, arts translation uses the word abashment. It's interesting. And Geshe Rabtin's book translates this one as consideration of others, which is an interesting translation idea. So these are 3 different translations of this same Tibetan word. So again, use whichever one you want. Consideration of others is kind of interesting, but anyway, I don't think any of the English terms quite get at the connotation in Tibetan. So that's what matters. Just like the previous one. Let's look at that. So I'll use the way it says it here, but it says, what is embarrassment? This is from the Abhidharma. So it says, it is an avoidance of misdeeds on account of others. It has the function of just that, acting as a support. And this gets at what you were mentioning, Sujata, acting as a support for the effective restraint from misconduct, right? So it's actually a mental factor that acts as a support for the effective restraint so here the actual, our translation gets at what you were getting at. And just as has been said above, I'm going to say self-respect is avoidance of misconduct on account of others, whereas embarrassment is, this one is an account, well, shame is an avoidance of misconduct. It should say embarrassment. That should say embarrassment, yeah. And so, and the point here, just to clarify, just to elaborate slightly, it's pretty straightforward. But usually this would be, it says below, your teachers, your gurus. So it'd be like, the first one is out of a sense of yourself. The second one is out of concern for others, or on account of others. And that could be like a sense of, if you felt like, wow, this could get, like if you thought like, oh, if my, I'll give a traditional Buddhist example. If you thought, if my guru found out I did this, I'd be embarrassed, then that's a reason not to do something, right? Like, so in other words, yeah. So if you thought, wow, if somebody told that'd be a traditional Tibetan Buddhist example, right? If somebody told my guru I did that, I'd be very embarrassed, so I better not do it. That'd be an example of this. But also one spiritual community, it's like if you felt like, wow, if the people in my spiritual community found that I did that, that would be kind of make me feel uncomfortable or embarrassed, then don't do that behavior, right? The Dalai Lama often talks about, he often says that, he says our public and private behavior should be congruent. In other words, and that's getting at the sense of like, right, that if somebody, where you have a mental state where you feel, if somebody finds out I did this, I wouldn't want to be embarrassed, so I shouldn't, so we should, so it restrains us from doing certain things. I'll read the paragraph below because it elaborates a little bit. It says, what is the difference between shame and embarrassment, using this translation? Although both of them are similar in terms of avoiding misconduct, I'm going to say self-respect is such that when one is about to engage in misconduct, one avoids it thinking, this is not something I should do. In the case of embarrassment, when one comes close to engaging in misconduct, one avoids it on account of others, thinking, if others were to despise me as a result of my engaging in this conduct, that would not be fitting. One avoids misconduct due to concern about the displeasure of one's gurus or one's teachers, the principal object causing this avoidance. Their function is specified as acting as support for the effective restraint from misconduct, which again gets at Sugata's point about it's a mental state, so it acts as support for restraining our physical or verbal behavior as well. And then because self-respect and embarrassment are definitely necessary for restraining misconduct of the 3, body, speech, and mind. If self-respect and embarrassment are absent, one will be unable to restrain oneself from any misconduct whatsoever. For without fear about the fruition from one's own side, and lacking concern about the displeasure of one's gurus or teachers and so forth, there will be no way to cease misconduct. And so, and actually, I just want to share, like, the one about others can also be, can also include, I just want to go back to the point about embarrassment. That can also include concern about others suffering, right? So in other words, if you feel wow, I want to do this, but if I do it, it will cause others to suffer. That would also be under what's considered embarrassment, right? Like, in other words, that if your concern is I'm going to restrain myself from a certain behavior because it's connected in connection with others, right? So that would be like empathy also, would it be included there, right? If you feel, wow, like I want to do this harsh thing, but if I do it, I'm going to hurt somebody. And then you're embarrassed, you feel like a sense of abashment or a sense of consideration of others. That's what that translation would come in. That would be another example of that mental fact, right? Is out of, what's the word? On account of others, right? So in other words, if you actually felt, or, also if you felt, oh, I want to do this, but it would make the world a worse place, right? And there are sentient beings in this world. So I'm going to restrain myself from doing that. Then that would be another example of the second of those two. And so what the paragraph is getting at, I just want to say, point out now, is, if you have neither of these, right? So if you think, well, I'm not going to restrain myself, if a person were to feel, I'm not going to restrain myself out of a sense of self-respect and concern about myself, and I'm also not going to restrain myself out of a concern for the feelings and opinions and welfare of others, then there's no reason left, actually, is what they're saying. Those are the only reasons to restrain, that beings restrain themselves, right? Whether it be, and again, because the first one includes everything from, your sense of, I made a commitment not to do this, to I'm concerned about the karmic results of it, to, whatever, I'll go to lower realms. I mean, those are all self. And then the other, right? They give the example of your teachers, but again, it includes like, oh, I wouldn't do this because it's going to hurt my friend, whatever. That's a concern for others, right? In other words, what they're getting at is, then there's nothing left. There's no reason left why a person would not restrain themselves. So we need these two mental factors to be an ethic. And what it's getting at is these two mental factors are required to be an ethical person. And one other just personal, as I've reflected on these mental factors, one personal reflection I'll make is, I'm relating it for a moment to like, sometimes I reflected on these two in relation to like Kohlberg, famously did a psychological, like a theory of moral development. And then I think Carol Gilligan did another one that was more grounded in feminist, added some feminist elements to it, which I thought was good too. They're both interesting. And what this is, I was relating those back to this Buddhist concept. And what Buddhism in a way is saying is like, Buddhism would say there are different reasons and different levels of moral. Buddhism would agree that there are different like levels of moral concern. And in a way, would say, and any level of moral concern is better than none. Is one point Buddhism making, like, because we don't want to hurt ourselves and each other, right? This is my personal reflection on this for a second. Like, and so what it's getting at is like, again, kind of in line with what we were saying earlier, for anybody, like, we need to start where we are, and like, so like, actually, it's kind of funny, right? If you think of the most base level of moral development is like, somebody will say, well, I'm not going to do that because I might get arrested. Good. Like, whatever. I mean, and or it's whatever stops somebody from killing somebody is better than killing the person, so, yeah, just, I mean, actually, it's funny, just recently, not that recently, but it was one point where I was literally working with a patient that was like, I don't want to get in, like, I don't want to have the hassles of doing, good, like, that's a good reason to not do something. I was glad that they thought that, because it was better than if they had done the opposite, and hurt somebody else. And there are like very exalted in Buddhism levels of moral development, right, that are grounded mostly in compassion. And those are really excellent. But what this is getting at is, what these two teachings are getting at is, all of those are helpful, like, for sentient beings. So like, because Buddhism is saying, like, if you're afraid of going to lower realms and that's why you don't do something, Buddhism would say, good. That's a good reason not to do something. And if you think of the Buddha would compassionately say to you, I don't want you to go to lower realms. Please don't do that so that you don't suffer, right? Like, and out of respect for yourself, please don't do this thing because it will cause you to suffer. And if you said, yeah, I don't want to do that for myself only, I don't care. If you said, even though this would hurt somebody else, I don't care, but I'm not going to do it because I don't want to go to lower realms. Buddha would say, great, that's wonderful. Now if somebody else, if later that same person, let's say, could say, I don't want to do it because I don't want to harm others and I have compassion, then the Buddha would say, great, wonderful, even better. But whatever reason we have at that time, this is what it's getting at in a way, is like, what's it say, right? Because karma is infallible, and because the purpose of our life is not to harm others and ideally to help them. Like, I just want to, like, whichever, I just think this paragraph is getting at a sense from Buddhism of, like, for sure there are more exalted, right? There are very exalted, subtle levels of compassion that bodhisattvas are capable of. And if we're capable of those, we should employ them, like the subtle levels of the bodhisattva vows and so on. But what Buddhism is getting at is whichever, if you don't do something out of a sense of, like, if they're in a monastery, if the monks in the monastery and they feel the disciplinarian is going to yell at me if I do this, that's embarrassment. And the monastery would say, good, I'm glad that the disciplinarian was serving their function that day. And later, and they would say, and hopefully later that same monk will become somebody who has a different reason for not doing it. But we all start where we are, and these are and all those different reasons why people restrain themselves are connected to one of these two different versions of one of these two concerns. So these are very much connected to ethics, and they're the two mental states that connect to that. So anyway, any questions or comments about those two? Lynn.
This makes me think of a former law partner of mine went over to the defense side. Okay, so we have a sexual harassment case, pretty bad stuff going on. And he ends up representing the employer and doing really sleazy stuff. So we have a conversation, and in the course of the conversation, I keep saying, that's a ridiculous argument. I felt like saying, look at yourself in the mirror. You should have some shame about that argument. And then I went to the second thing, the embarrassment. I said, because his wife is a big feminist. So I thought, does Jenny know you're making this argument? And it was like both sides of it, because he should be ashamed of himself for making the argument. I mean, you can defend the person or the entity, the employer, but not with strip clubs and all this sexual harassment. I mean, it was really embarrassing, right? And it was, I think of that example, and it was like both things come into play. If you don't have any shame for yourself, how about if your wife found out about it?
Did either one work?
Well, I didn't say either one, because it wouldn't help the case. Anyway, we ended up settling, but it was like, it was in the moment. I thought, how can you do this work on the defense side and look yourself in the face? And then I went to, and what do you go tell your wife at night? Because she would be horrified if she knew you did this today. Wow. So anyway, it's sort of the two things. Yeah.
Wow, but he didn't have either, so there was nothing to restrain him from.
That's right. It's all money, Yeah, money.
Wow.
But anyway, it was like funny when they divide these up, and I'm thinking, that's actually how it happens.
Yeah, if you can get someone to do either, it's good, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
Even or yourself, so ourselves or someone else.
Yeah.
Did somebody else have their hand up? Okay. Oh, Frank.
It just made me think. So every once in a while, I'll hear a teaching, and they'll talk about a yogi or a master that excelled in ethical discipline. And I often thought, well, you would think that all masters would be kind of equally in ethical discipline, but some, just like you might excel in bodhicitta, or you might excel in them, they're excelling in ethical. And so I really couldn't quite understand, how do you excel in that, like that, at that level? Do you have any insights on that?
That's interesting. Yeah, well, one point I'll make, like, if a text is saying that in Buddhism, it might be sometimes like I think like, I'm gonna say this right way, like, you know, like for, especially in Tibetan, in the Tibetan, well, in Buddhist traditions, actually, it's really true in a way, like that, I mean, even some, I mean, I'm no expert on this topic, but some Tibetan monks will say, you know, that like the Vinaya is very detailed with many, many, you know, like the monks and nuns, both take so many different like vows and, you know, and I mean, hundreds of them. And I think it's true actually that like not, you know, actually I'll make a general point, which is like, you know, even like, so even among Buddhist teachers, like, actually, you know, when they do like the Geshe studies, like the study of Vinaya comes quite late in their studies. And some of the monks and nuns don't study Vinaya a very detailed way. So like, you know, like my sense from, again, I'm not a monk or nun, but when I've heard some explanations about this, you know, like they all, obviously everybody, you know, knows the root, the main big vows that where you no longer be a monk or a nun, or if you do, you know, like killing a human being or, you know, they're, and so on. But in terms of the details, like I think it's probably getting at that there are some scholars who really studied the Vinaya very well, and then who actually follow it very detailed. And there are a lot of Tibetan people who have said to me that, like, you know, like they've said, like, for example, I know some Tibetan monks have said, well, you know, in Tibetan culture, sometimes we don't follow the Vinaya as carefully. Some monks don't follow it as carefully as, say, the Theravada monks do. They follow the rules, you know, not eating in the afternoon, for example, and other very detailed, you know, points. And then they'll say, but, you know, there are some monks and nuns who do actually, who really study the Vinaya and then follow even the difficult ones that are kind of not commonly followed or something, you know, in the culture, you know, where like the kind of culture, you know, and, that the, you know, the culture doesn't demand it of them, but they just decide they want to really be strict in following that because they have a deep respect for the details of the Vinaya. So I think I was probably getting it. My guess is that it's probably getting at something like that. And you do see that actually, like where even like Lama Zopa Rinpoche said that once. I remember the example of what you're getting at was, I guess, like he said, oh, he was praising his guru, Kirti Senchab Rinpoche, who's passed away now, but was one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's gurus. And he said, oh, he follows the Vinaya very strictly. If you notice when he's walking, he always looks down, and then if he looks up, it's to see where he's going, but he's not like glancing around at objects of. And he said, like, oh, many monks, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche was pointing out, many monks will, like, you know, are looking around like the way a layperson might, you know, oh, look at the pretty scenery, oh, there's people passing by. But I guess I didn't know this, but there was like a Vinaya rule like that, you know, monks kind of don't look around much unless they have to for safety or for consideration of others, but they're not out of sort of, because there's a recognition of craving arising. And he was like praising, he was saying Kirti Senchab Rinpoche follows the Vinaya so strictly, you know, even if you watch him walk through an airport or something, he's following the Vinaya. He was making this point. You know, so to me, that's an example of what I think they're getting at, is that some people really are very stricter in following those kind of details of the ethical rules, and others are, you know, it's not a criticism, but like are more relaxed or something, and something like that.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. But any last, or is everybody good? Oh, Sujata.
I know we're coming up on the end of class, and maybe it's something for a future class, but I just want to name this connection that I'm having in my mind between shame and embarrassment and the 8 worldly dharmas. And I think sometimes I spontaneously have this experience of like, oh, I don't want to, I just had it last week, you know, where like, you know, we were hanging out a little too late after a meditation session kind of, and the monks need to go to bed, and, you know, our teacher came out of his room and it was like, oh, you know, and so, and he was friendly, but I know that like, that was not cool. Like we needed to go, and it's not, don't hang out at night where the monks live, right? And so on the way home, I was like analyzing my response. And, you know, there's a part of it in here that would be like, rejoice, you know, rejoice in your experience of embarrassment. You don't want to bother. But then I immediately go to beating myself up on the 8 worldly. I was concerned with, you know, praise and blame and, you know, fame and infamy. Like I'm the meditation instructor, and now I'm the one who was like keeping the monks up at night. So like, I think that it's just something interesting to notice, particularly with the 8 worldly dharmas in relationship to like holy objects, or I think I get really confused around the relationship of the 8 worldly dharmas to, and also other things like the, you know, the Tantrayana and stuff. That's way big question. But I just, it's just something that I'm struggling with, that maybe there's more that can be touched on later about the relationship of the 8 worldly dharmas to these kinds of that seem like, you know, I see that they're positive mental states, but I quickly jump to noticing where there's like the mixed motive, the ego-driven piece of it.
Well, that's just an interesting point. First of all, I know we got to stop, but I'll say one thing is it would be good to come back to that. And then, so maybe we can next time go into it more, but just one brief comment for now and then I'll stop. But I just think it would be interesting to kind of reflect on, I think you're right though, that like one could almost, there's a text by Chandra Goman that sort of does an analysis like this, not of that point, but it's similar. But like, I guess my point is, what would be interesting to look at is, for myself, actually, I'll try it between now and next time, is like, you know, if you look at the definition here, like let's say of concern for others, right? Or concern for self, like to look at where's the line where it's still serving as a restraint, an effective cause of restraint, and then it's a virtue, right? Like so like in your example, if it were me, I'd like up to the point where I felt, oh wow, I inconvenienced this teacher and I don't want to do that again. I'll be more careful next time. Like that's clearly virtue, right? But then it's like there's a fine line where one goes over a line, right? And then it's like it becomes something else that's no longer the virtue, right? And like I don't know the answer yet, but I think that's worth contemplating. Like, where's the line where you go from a virtuous state of mind that's actually serving the function of restraint, you know, or the same with yourself, right? Like, there's a point where you think, you know, oh, I wouldn't want to do that because that's not the kind of person I want to be, or something, right? Or it's not in line with my ethics. And then there comes another, where we go over a line to what's wrong with me, I'm so bad, I'm terrible, I'm whatever. That's no longer a restraint, it's actually a kind of something else, you know, and it's no longer a virtuous mental factor. I just think that's an interesting question, like, where is that line? I think that would be interesting to explore, like, and think about. So I'll think about it personally. But I know we're past the time, and I just realized also yesterday we're scheduled for one more class this month, but then we haven't scheduled yet. I haven't put up a schedule for November and December. And I know there's holidays in those months, so I'll send out one. I'll send it to Gabe within a week to make sure it's up soon, and with a schedule for the next couple months through the end of the year. So sorry I had forgotten to do that until I only thought of it yesterday. But let's do our dedication. Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinmazik Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these virtuous merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from the inside, so that the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks, everybody. Great to see y'all.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lauren.
Appreciate
See you
it.
soon.
Hi, guys.
Good to see you.